The same weapon system that dismantled Russia's logistics network in Ukraine, that turned the tide of one of the most brutal land wars in modern European history, is now pointing north, not toward the steppes of Eastern Europe, not toward a frontline trench, toward the Arctic, toward ice, silence, and a geography most of the world has never thought of as a battlefield. And in the last 24 hours, Canada made it official. A $1.9 billion deal, 26 HIMARS systems, long-range precision strike capability that Canada has never possessed in its entire modern military history. And almost no one is asking the question that actually matters. Who is this really aimed at? This is Strike Vector, where power shifts are decoded before they reach the headlines. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in, because what you're about to hear changes the strategic map of North America entirely. Let's establish what just happened before we get to why it matters. Canada's Department of National Defence confirmed the acquisition of 26 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, known globally as HIMARS. The deal is valued at approximately 1.9 billion Canadian dollars. These are not defensive installations. These are not watchtowers or early warning radar stations. These are precision-guided mobile rocket artillery platforms capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 300 kilometers with the right munitions. They are the same weapons that Ukraine used to systematically destroy Russian ammunition depots, command posts, and supply bridges so effectively that Russian forces were forced to move their logistics hundreds of kilometers further from the front lines. And now Canada has bought 26 of them. That is not a small number. That is a strategic statement. 26 HIMARS launchers spread across a country the size of Canada doesn't just fill a capability gap. It creates a national precision strike network. And when you understand the geography these systems are being designed to operate in, that's when the picture starts to become something far more serious than a routine procurement announcement. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is what these systems are being configured to do. The Canadian Armed Forces didn't just buy HIMARS launchers. They bought them with explicit integration plans for future land-based anti-ship missile capability. Read that again. Anti-ship missiles, not artillery for a land battle, not systems for suppressing an infantry advance. Anti-ship missiles designed to strike naval vessels, large ones, at distance. In the Arctic coastal environment, this changes everything about how we should read this announcement. Canada's northern coastline is not a border in the traditional sense. It is thousands of kilometers of remote, largely unmonitored, strategically critical geography that sits at the intersection of the Atlantic and Pacific approach routes, the polar transit corridors, and the increasingly contested waters of the Arctic Ocean. Any naval force that wants to project power into North America from the north has to pass through or near these waters. And Canada just announced that it intends to put precision strike systems along that coast that can reach out 300 kilometers and destroy ships before they ever come close to shore. Military analysts are already warning that this represents a fundamental shift in Canadian strategic doctrine. For decades, Canada's defense posture was built almost entirely around cooperation, integration into NATO frameworks, and continental defense through NORAD alongside the United States. Canada did not maintain independent long-range strike capability. It did not need to, because the assumption was that any threat serious enough to require long-range precision fires would be handled by American assets. That assumption is gone, and the purchase of HIMARS is the formal announcement that it is gone. This is where things get deeper, because the decision to buy HIMARS is not just a military procurement story. It is a political signal, a strategic realignment, and a direct response to a threat environment that has changed more dramatically in the last 18 months than at any point since the Cold War. Let's talk about the Arctic, because most people fundamentally misunderstand what is happening there right now. The Arctic is warming at roughly 4 times the average global rate. That is not a climate science footnote. That is a military logistics breakthrough. As ice recedes, sea lanes that were previously impassable for most of the year become navigable for longer and longer windows. The Northern Sea Route, which runs along Russia's Arctic coastline, has seen a dramatic increase in transit traffic. More critically for Western defense planners, the Arctic Ocean is emerging as a plausible operating environment for submarine warfare, surface fleet projection, and potentially even land approach corridors that simply did not exist in practical military planning a generation ago. Russia has been building Arctic military infrastructure at an extraordinary pace. Reconstructed Soviet-era bases, new radar installations, expanded icebreaker fleets, both civilian and military, nuclear-powered submarines operating under Arctic ice at increasing frequency. And China, despite having no Arctic coastline, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and has been investing heavily in polar research, shipping, and infrastructure partnerships that defense analysts interpret as dual use. Civilian on the surface, with obvious military applications underneath. Canada sits at the geographic center of this new pressure. And Canada, until this announcement, had almost no credible response capability. Intelligence reports suggest that Canadian defense planners have been watching this development with increasing alarm for several years. The acquisition of HIMARS is described internally not as a future capability investment, but as an emergency gap fill. A recognition that the window between now and when the Arctic becomes a genuinely contested military space is shrinking faster than previously modeled. The question is no longer whether Canada needs long-range strike capability. The question was how quickly it could acquire something credible, and this is where things get worse. Deliveries of these 26 systems are not expected to begin until 2029, 3 years from now, possibly longer, depending on production schedules, training pipelines, and the complexities of Arctic-configured integration, which means Canada has just made a very public, very loud strategic announcement, and it cannot back it up for at least 3 years. That is what defense analysts call a posture window, a period of declared intent without operational capability. And in the current threat environment, a posture window is not just uncomfortable, it is potentially dangerous. Think about what Canada has effectively communicated to every strategic actor monitoring Western defense procurement. Canada has said, we see the threat, we are responding to it, and we will have a credible long-range strike network in the Arctic within this decade. That announcement has strategic value in terms of deterrence and alliance signaling. But it also communicates something else. It tells every adversary exactly how long they have before that capability exists. 3 years is a known window, and known windows invite pressure. Defense experts understand that in great power competition, the period between announced capability and operational capability is one of the most vulnerable periods a state can occupy. You have declared your strategic intent, which removes ambiguity and can prevent miscalculation. But you have also revealed the timeline of your current weakness. It is a calculated risk, and Canada's leadership clearly decided the signaling value outweighed the exposure risk. Whether that calculation is correct is a question that will be answered not in press releases, but in strategic behavior over the next 36 months. But let's go back to the operational picture, because the delivery timeline is only part of what makes this announcement extraordinary. Even before a single system arrives, the strategic logic of what Canada is building is genuinely significant. HIMARS is not a stationary system. That is not an incidental feature. That is the core of its strategic value. A HIMARS launcher is a wheeled platform. It fires, it moves, it disappears before any counterstrike can be organized. In military doctrine, this is called shoot and scoot. It is the operational concept that made HIMARS so devastating in Ukraine. Russian forces could not destroy what they could not find. And by the time they located a launch site, the launcher was already 30 kilometers away in a different position. Now apply that concept to Canada's geography. Canada has the second largest landmass on Earth. Its northern territories are among the most remote and logistically challenging environments on the planet. Roads are sparse, infrastructure is minimal, surveillance is difficult. A HIMARS launcher operating in Canada's north can emerge from the interior, deploy to a coastal firing position, engage a naval target at 300 kilometers, and vanish back into the landscape before any adversary has processed what just happened. And critically, HIMARS platforms are air transportable. They can be loaded onto Canada's C-130J tactical transports or its C-17 strategic airlifters and moved anywhere in the country within hours. Within hours. That is not a defense network. That is a rapid deployment precision strike force that can materialize anywhere along thousands of kilometers of Arctic coastline on very short notice. Military analysts are already modeling what a network of 26 such systems, properly distributed across Canada's northern territory, would mean for naval access to Arctic waters near the Canadian landmass. The conclusion is stark. Any surface fleet attempting to operate within 300 kilometers of the Canadian Arctic coast would be operating inside a precision strike envelope with no reliable counter. Not unless that fleet came with dedicated land attack capacity and was prepared to conduct a combined arms operation to suppress the HIMARS network before approaching. That is an enormous operational cost. That is the definition of a credible deterrent. And this is where the anti-ship missile integration becomes the truly game-changing element of this story. HIMARS, in its current configuration, fires a family of munitions designed primarily for land-based targets. The GMLRS rocket for shorter-range precision strikes, the ATACMS ballistic missile for extended range engagement out to 300 kilometers. Both are devastating against stationary or slow-moving land targets. But the future integration of a land-based anti-ship missile, a system that can engage a vessel at sea from a ground-based launcher, is the capability that fundamentally redraws the threat calculus for any adversary contemplating naval operations near the Canadian Arctic. The United States has been developing and fielding this concept through its own Typhoon missile battery system, which is capable of launching Tomahawk cruise missiles and SM-6 missiles from a ground-based platform. Canada's stated intent is to integrate a similar anti-ship capability into the HIMARS framework. If achieved, that means a Canadian launcher operating from a position somewhere in the remote Canadian north could track a surface vessel at ranges that make interception extremely difficult and engage it with a precision-guided weapon that would be virtually impossible to avoid without prior warning and advanced electronic countermeasures. That is not a defensive capability. That is sea control from land. That changes everything about what it means to operate a naval force in the waters surrounding North America. Now let's address what everyone in the room is thinking, but what almost no mainstream coverage is willing to say directly. Canada is a member of NATO. Canada is one of the United States' closest allies. The assumption built into almost every piece of public commentary on this acquisition is that these systems are being purchased in response to Russian and potentially Chinese Arctic activity. And that is certainly part of the story. But defense experts understand that military capabilities are never built in a single threat context. They are built to respond to the threat environment as it actually exists. And the threat environment facing Canada in 2026 includes factors that would have been nearly unthinkable 5 years ago. The relationship between Canada and the United States has undergone a profound and destabilizing shift. Trade disputes, tariff conflicts, and rhetoric from Washington about Canadian sovereignty and integration have created a level of strategic uncertainty in Ottawa that is historically unprecedented. Canadian defense planners are not naive. They understand that the United States has always been, simultaneously, Canada's most important ally and its most powerful neighbor. And in a period when the nature of that alliance is being actively renegotiated at the highest political levels, the acquisition of independent strike capability is not only directed at external adversaries, it is also a hedge. It is Canada saying to every strategic actor, including those to the south, that it is developing the capacity to defend its own territory on its own terms. That is a massive geopolitical statement, and it is being buried inside a procurement announcement that most people are reading as a straightforward defense modernization story. Intelligence reports suggest that the decision to publicly confirm this acquisition, rather than managing it quietly through defense procurement channels, was deliberate. Canada wanted this announcement visible. Canada wanted the strategic community to understand what it was doing and why. The press release was not a bureaucratic formality. It was a signal to Moscow, to Beijing, to Washington, to every actor that has been watching Canada's vast, underfunded, underarmed northern flank and calculating what might be possible there. The calculation has changed. But here's where the analysis has to become honest about the risks, because this is not a clean story with a simple conclusion. Canada buying HIMARS is strategically significant. It is arguably necessary given the security environment, but it is not without serious complications. And those complications do not have clean answers. Consider the first option that presents itself as a solution. Canada simply accelerates the delivery timeline, pushes Lockheed Martin and the U.S. government to fast-track production, gets the systems in Canadian hands by 2027 instead of 2029. On the surface, this seems straightforward. In practice, it runs directly into one of the most congested defense production pipelines in decades. The United States, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, support pipelines, Taiwan, and multiple other partners are all drawing on the same HIMARS production capacity. There is no slack in the system. Accelerating Canada's delivery almost certainly means delaying someone else's. And in the current global security environment, almost every one of those deliveries is time sensitive. This option does not solve the problem. It redistributes it. Consider the second option. Canada fills the capability gap with interim systems, purchases shorter-range artillery, additional air defense, or other stopgap measures that provide some operational capacity while waiting for HIMARS deliveries. The challenge here is that interim systems require their own training pipelines, their own logistics chains, their own integration work. Canada's military is not large. Its training capacity is not unlimited. Asking the Canadian Armed Forces to simultaneously integrate interim systems while also preparing for HIMARS creates a training and logistics burden that could actually degrade readiness rather than improve it. This option also does not work. Consider the third option. Canada accelerates its partnership with the United States through NORAD and requests prepositioned American assets to fill the gap during the posture window. This has political logic, it has precedent, and it carries its own enormous problem. Inviting deeper American military presence into Canadian Arctic territory at a moment when the political relationship between Ottawa and Washington is strained is not a neutral decision. It is a statement about dependency at exactly the moment Canada is trying to demonstrate strategic autonomy. The optics are reversed. The signal sent is the opposite of what the HIMARS purchase was designed to communicate. Consider the fourth option. Canada accepts the posture window as a calculated risk and relies on the deterrence value of the public announcement itself to reduce the probability of adversary exploitation during the gap period. This is actually the option that Ottawa appears to have chosen. And it may be correct, but it carries a level of strategic vulnerability that should not be minimized. Deterrence through announced future capability only works if adversaries believe the timeline is real, the commitment is sustained, and the operational concept is credible. Any signal of political wavering, budget pressure, or procurement delay during the next 36 months would erode exactly the deterrence value that makes the announcement strategically worthwhile. There is no good option here. There is a least bad option, and even that requires a level of political steadiness and defense investment discipline that Canada has historically struggled to maintain. Now let's pull back to the global picture, because what Canada is doing does not exist in isolation. It is one piece of a broader pattern that is reshaping the strategic architecture of the entire Western alliance in real time. Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Europe is rearming at a pace not seen since the 1982. Poland is building the largest ground force in Europe outside of Russia. The Baltic states are transforming into fortified defensive corridors. The United Kingdom is reinvesting in long-range strike and maritime patrol. Australia is acquiring nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS. And now Canada is entering the precision strike era for the first time in its modern military history. What is happening is a structural transformation of the Western security order. For roughly 30 years after the Cold War, the prevailing assumption was that liberal democratic prosperity had made large-scale strategic competition a relic. Armies shrank, defense budgets fell, precision military capability was concentrated in the United States and a handful of major allies, with the logic that this concentration was sufficient because the threats were manageable. That logic has collapsed. And what is replacing it is a diffusion of serious military capability across a much wider network of states that have concluded, individually and collectively, that strategic self-reliance is no longer optional. Canada entering this picture is significant, not just because of what Canada itself can do, but because of what it signals about the breadth of the realignment. Canada is not a country with a history of aggressive military posture. Canada has positioned itself for decades as a peacekeeping nation, a multilateral actor, a state whose military identity was fundamentally cooperative rather than independent. The acquisition of long-range precision strike capability is a departure from that identity so significant that it should be understood as a moment of strategic transformation, not a routine modernization cycle. This changes everything about how Canada sees itself as a military actor. Defense experts understand that Canada's geographic position makes this transformation particularly consequential. Canada controls vast Arctic approaches. Canada sits astride the northern air defense corridors for the North American continent. Canada's coastlines touch 3 oceans: the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic. A Canada that can project precision strikes across those environments is not the same actor as a Canada that cannot. And the strategic relationships that surround Canada with the United States, with Russia across the Arctic, with European NATO allies across the Atlantic, all shift when that capability exists. Let's be direct about what this looks like from Moscow. Russia has been the most aggressive Arctic militarizer over the past decade. It has rebuilt bases, forward-deployed forces, and publicly asserted Arctic sovereignty in ways that have alarmed Western planners. Russia's nuclear submarine fleet operates extensively under Arctic ice. Think about what this really tells you. When a nation that has spent 75 years avoiding independent strike capability suddenly spends $2 billion to acquire it, that is not a procurement decision. That is a declaration. When that capability is explicitly designed for Arctic coastal defense with anti-ship integration, that is not a capability gap being filled. That is a strategic architecture being built. When the announcement is made publicly, immediately, in the full view of every adversary and every ally, that is not an accident. That is a message. The question you should be sitting with right now is not whether Canada made the right call. The question is what it tells you about what the people with access to classified threat assessments, real-time intelligence feeds, and closed-door alliance briefings believe is coming. Because decisions like this don't get made in peacetime comfort. They get made when the people in the room have seen something that the public hasn't seen yet. When the gap between the classified picture and the public picture has grown wide enough that even the announcement of the response carries more signal than most people are equipped to read. What did they see? What does the intelligence picture of the Arctic in 2026 actually look like behind the classification markings? What scenario did Canadian defense planners model that made $2 billion for 26 rocket launchers feel not just justified, but urgent? We don't have those answers. But the purchase itself is an answer of its own kind. And if you know how to read it, it tells you more than any press release ever will. Stay sharp, stay informed. And if this broke something open for you, share it, because this story is only beginning.